Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am very happy to be joined by Professor Floudas. He is very Greek in the first, but in the second, he's here to talk about the situation in Ukraine. He is a legal, geopolitical, international affairs thought leader. He's an adjunct professor at the law faculty of Immanuel Kant Baltic Federal University and a fellow of the Hellenic Institute of Foreign and International Law and a senior advisor to the Cambridge Existential Risks Initiative. He has been everywhere you want to be, including the BBC and the Financial Times and the Washington Post and all these sorts of places. And so today we're going to have a grand old time because we're going to be talking about a very hot topic that I have been doing the rounds on myself, and that is the situation in Ukraine. It's dragged on for almost 3 years. We don't know when or if this thing is ever going to stop, and it's costing a lot of money and all this sort of thing. So we're going to dig into this topic and find out what's going on. So welcome to the Cameron Journal podcast.
My pleasure to be with you, Cameron. Thank you for calling me in.
Yes, so let's start from the beginning. Um, a lot of my listenership won't know who you are, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll find out about what's going on in Eastern Europe.
Well, you gave a pretty good formal introduction of me, and that's all quite correct. What I would say in a few very short sentences, just to add up, is that I've lived in Russia and Ukraine and have worked there. And in fact, I advised both governments, believe it or not. And altogether, this was about 9 years. And I have a much better understanding of the two countries than most of the Western pundits that we see in our media. Now, in addition to that, of course, I am a foreign affairs analyst and an academic and a practicing lawyer. But my interest and knowledge of Ukraine and Russia is not merely academic, but it is very practical. And as you say, I still have an adjunct chair in the Russian Federation. So I have a number of people that I can rely on to get some real bona fide information of how they perceive things and how they feel about certain stuff.
All right. Well, that's very good. Thank you for slumming it on down here to the podcast world. We appreciate it. This is going to be exciting. Um, So, since being that you have talked to both sides and been involved in the region and all this type of thing, you were one of the few people that predicted this war and knew it would happen. Um, when I was in grad school studying diplomacy, it was in like we would always sit down and talk about what were the top three most likely wars to happen between the great powers, and this one was always in the top five. So I was surprised that Putin made the move, but not necessarily surprised, sort of thing. So what signs did you see that told you, yeah, this is gonna happen? And we should get ready for it.
Well, let's go back to when Putin took over and was elected president in the year 2000. Things were going quite well until the year 2004. And what happened then was the so-called Orange Revolution. And this brought in Ukraine, and this brought a pro-Western regime in Kiev. And after that, there was a constant running battle, but obviously on the diplomatic and technical means, not the kind of hot war that we have now. So, for example, the Russians were putting embargo on gas deliveries, natural gas deliveries into the Ukraine. The Ukrainians did not want to accept Russia in the World Trade Organization, and they were vetoing. So this kind of thing, constant annoyances from each other. And what I thought was going to happen is that as long as this was continuing, it would be fine. There wouldn't be a war. Why I predicted a conflict, and that was for the first time around 2010, was because the Ukrainians were actually making significant moves towards joining the Western alliance, that is the European Union and NATO. And of course, I knew that this was a big red line, especially NATO, for the Russians. And I had been told that formally and more importantly, informally, a number of times back in 2008. And that's when I thought, well, things, if we, the West, do not back down on this, and the Ukrainians do not change their mind, then there's going to be a war. And I hope that someone at some point is going to understand that and will back off. But the Russians would never back off because that was, as I said, a very big red line for them that should not be crossed.
I'm curious about that because when the war first broke out, I had a list of people wanting to talk to me as long as your arm. And I was saying at the time, I said, Ukraine is not an issue for Putin as long as he controls the government in Kyiv. As long as the government in Kyiv stays pro-Moscow, not pro-Western, then everything is all fine and kosher. And anytime that changes, Russia gets very nervous. Um, and they use various tools to do this. Anytime they want to roll out a new hacking thing or a new propaganda tool or whatever have you, Ukraine tends to be their petri dish to do that. Um, and so given kind of what had happened in that election with Poroshenko and a, pro-Western government in Ukraine openly declaring, we're going to start the process for EU ascension. My first thought was, wonder what Putin's going to do about that. That's not what necessarily what he wants to hear. Um, but I'll admit, I didn't quite believe he'd roll the tanks, given the condition of the hardware. Like, you know, um, it's old, it's failing, half of it doesn't work, all this type of thing. I was very surprised that he went for the direct solution to the problem as opposed to his old tricks. What, in your opinion, made this time different for him?
Well, first of all, let me point and give you my take on things. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best or the most correct. I do not feel that the, let's say, the equipment, the war equipment and the arms of Russians have done so badly. What's, under the circumstances, what they never had planned for was a full-scale invasion. And this is why it failed so miserably at the beginning, because as one has to understand that for some very weird reasons that we can discuss a bit later, this ended up as being the biggest clandestine operation in military history. Even the generals who were leading the troops did not know until 48 hours before. So that means as well that they had not refurbished their tanks and their rations and their supply lines and what have you about their material. Hence, it's so bad. So now that we can see that they're getting their act together and things are much better. Now, to answer the question that you did, why did he actually let the tanks roll in? As I just mentioned, this was going to be a clandestine operation that no one knew about. It's very interesting that I believe 5 days before the invasion, before the 22nd of February 2022, there was a televised meeting of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, which is the body that actually takes decisions about war, about peace, who are we going to nuke and all that on paper. And you could see from the part that was actually televised, because the rest was behind closed doors, that these people knew nothing about the impending invasion. And we're talking about 5 days before the 22nd of February. Now, I used to think until very recently that it was at that time, during the closed doors discussions afterwards, that Putin told the Security Council and his closest confidants and about what he was planning to do in a few days' time. I read just last week, however, a well-researched article in the Financial Times, I have to say, so good journalism. And according to that, in the secret meeting, the Security Council in Moscow was not told about it. That even shocked me. Certainly, the foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, from what we hear, actually received a phone call in the middle of the night, and he was told, you know what, we have started to invade Ukraine. And he was completely flabbergasted. And we're talking about the foreign minister who has been on since 2020, when Putin became president. So the reason behind all this secrecy is, as I said, this was not going to be a real military invasion, not a kind of what we were doing in the Iraq war, that kind of thing. This was going to be a decapitation operation. The main objective was, yes, of course, to completely throw the Ukrainians out of balance by attacking both in the east, in the south from Crimea, from the north from Belarus. But the main strategic objective was for the airborne troops to take over Kostomel Airport, which is a military airport very close to Kiev, and use that as a ground of operations where they would actually execute a decapitation strike, either kill or disable, or best of all, capture Zelensky and some other top people, and essentially bloodlessly, more or less, impose what you very well said, a friendly regime, a pro-Russian regime in Kiev. And then after a couple of weeks of stabilizing the situation, knowing that the people more or less, the Ukrainians, accepted what had just happened, the troops would leave, most of them at least, perhaps leaving some token sentinels around, and things would go their own way as the Russians have wished.
Well, I mean, based upon that, I would say this war has gotten a little bit out of control. Gone on for way longer, with way greater expense and much more international isolation than they were originally planning on.
Yes, this is true. Because even though the first parts and the invasion failed utterly and miserably, no one expected, not even the Ukrainians themselves were expecting this kind of fierce resistance against the Russians. The Russians, as we explained before, were not really prepared for any kind of invasion. What happened in Kostomel airport didn't work out, again, because of very brave and courageous resistance by the Ukrainians. So one would think, well, why don't the Russians back away? They gambled, they lost the first part. Why do they keep on doing it? Why is it getting out of hand? It is getting out of hand because this Ukraine under Western rule, if you want, Western allied, we should better say, is an anathema and considered to be an existential risk for Russia. And that encompasses everyone. I mean, people on the right in Russia, on the left, pro-Putinists, anti-Putinists. I would say that 80% of the population, 85% of the population would be happy with the actions of the Russians taking military measures in order to prevent that.
Now, yes, and let's talk about NATO for a moment. Because someone had mentioned, because one of the big debates was is it just a Ukraine is getting too Western problem, or is it they're trying to get the jump on NATO problem, all this type of thing. And I said, my opinion is I don't think it's a NATO problem. If Putin's that concerned about NATO countries bordering him, he should invade Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia or several other places. I mean, there's other places one can invade that would be closer and more strategically relevant, sort of thing. So, why there sort of thing. Um, and to some degree with this whole thing, that's made his problem worse because Finland and Sweden, who had no intention of ever joining NATO, in 6 months joined up. So now there is a continuous border through Eastern Europe, north to south, except for Ukraine, sort of thing. There's this giant land border between NATO and Russia. So it seems like he's made the problem worse. So do you really think it is a NATO alliance issue and he's trying to get a head start on counterbalancing that? Or is it simply a matter of he wants Ukraine as the buffer between Russia and the rest of Europe?
Clearly the seconds. It is not, of course, if in a perfect possible world, the Russians would not want more NATO on their borders, but they
Fair
were,
enough.
again, to push the envelope so much as regards Ukraine not being in NATO, in order and accepting the losses, well, the strategic losses that they have with Finland and Sweden, perpetually neutral countries joining NATO. Now, the way that the Russians see it is that, first of all, there is never going to be an attack from Sweden or from Finland into Russia. And there is, and in any case, they were never going to be considered as in our own friendly countries, and they were never parts of Russia as well. Ukraine, however, has a very different place in the Russian psyche and mentality. And you can see that by the famous Tucker Carlson interview, where Putin spent about 1 hour rambling about very dense and detailed historical backgrounds going back to the Middle Ages. The reason for that is that not that he is deluded or anything, but it was trying to explain, not necessarily to, well, to the West, that this part of the world is different from us. Let us not forget also that it was Kiev, now in Ukraine, that was the ancestral seat of the Rus, the original medieval Russians. It was afterwards that they moved northeast towards Moscow and then towards St. Petersburg. So it
No,
is
it's good that I don't mean to interrupt, but it's good that you mentioned that because I mentioned to people, I've said, here's the thing with a place like Ukraine. Ukraine became independent in 1991, for the first time since Catherine the Great, 300 years. Um, and I think a lot of people, especially from the post-Soviet period, have family in Ukraine, are from there themselves. They have an auntie, a grandma, a cousin, or somebody who lives down that sort of thing. It's like if we suddenly lost Florida tomorrow. It's like we wake up one day and Florida's no longer part of the United States, but we still have family and friends. Maybe we go to Disney World there, and if you're Jewish, you have family there, and all this sort of thing. It's like that. So I think in the mind of Putin and a lot of the Russians, it's kind of like, why are you a separate country? You've always been part of like you've been part of us for so long, sort of thing. And I think in the negotiations of everything in the post-Soviet period, um, you know, kind of lines got drawn and people got separated, and it maybe didn't make as much sense as it used to. And so I think it's a kind of an odd thing. And while we may say the Ukrainian people have a right to their own national self-determination, I think in the mind of Russians, that's still part of Russia. And it had been for hundreds of years. So, you know, it should be again. And I think psychologically watching them try to leave, it's like losing a child almost, to the dark forces of the West.
I very much like your analysis, and we agree almost completely in that. This is the reasons that you mentioned are the main factors that make the whole Ukraine issue so much more important for the Russians. It is, in fact, very much the case still that there are millions of Ukrainians living in Russia and Russians living in Ukraine, at least until the war. And everyone you ask from your friends, Russian friends, when I was living there, they were saying, "Oh, I'm half Ukrainian. My mother was Ukrainian, and she met my father at university in Moscow, and then they got married, and this is how I came about." I mean, you have that over and over and over again. And let us face it, it was especially Ukraine hurt the in the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Ukraine independence hurt more than anything else. Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, these are different ethnic groupings. They are ethnically different, religiously different. They speak a different language, and the Baltics as well, because you mentioned that why didn't they attack Lithuania? Well, Lithuania again, and all the other Baltics, they are different countries. Different. Of course, they're different countries. What I'm trying to say is that they're ethnically different. They have been independent. They have had independence for much longer than Ukraine. In fact, to be honest, the current Ukraine, more or less, was only independent for a year or so during the Russian Civil War, from which happened after the October Revolution, and until the Reds, the communists, won the Civil War against the Whites, the Royalists, and in 1922 proclaimed the Soviet Union as we know it and as we knew it. So what's another reason that I have, or another way that I have tried to describe that, is that this attack is also a bit of an honor killing. Your sister has prostituted herself with the West, and that is why she needs to be punished. And we have to understand that this is certainly a very deep underlying thought. You're not going to hear much about it being discussed by the Russians, but as a non-Russian, that's how I see and perceive some of the undercurrents.
Right. And I want to talk about, to borrow a phrase, matters of war and peace. Um, March 2022, there was a peace deal on the table. There was a hope that we could bring this to a relatively speedy conclusion. Didn't happen. Why not?
Well, history will tell us in 20, 30 years. From the information that we have now, it seems that the British, in particular Prime Minister Johnson, were instrumental in pushing the Ukrainians not to sign a peace deal at the time. the Americans as well, but it was not at such a high level as the Prime Minister of Britain himself going to Kiev and say, don't sign. It was just done remotely. They were saying no. Let us not forget that it was and is in the interests of the United States to have a proxy war going against Russia, because this is creating constant trouble and friction and damages and deaths in Russia. And this, of course, as it is well known, was one of the schemes which had first been made open already in 2019 in the infamous RAND report entitled Extending Russia. Have you heard of that report?
Not until you brought it up, so why don't you tell us all about it? I'm as uneducated as the listener.
You're not uneducated at all. You know absolutely everything, Cameron. In 2009, the RAND think tank, and we know that this is primarily financed by the US Armed Forces, uh, they brought up they brought out a report openly called Extending Russia. In essence, this report contained 50 ways that Russia could be cut down to size without a direct war between the US and Russia. 50 ways that could be utilized for the for the US to actually diminish Russian influence. One of these 50s is cause a war between Russia and Ukraine. Shocking, but true. Rand and I have to applaud that because they have guts, at least. And to be fair, they still have that report on the website and they have not retracted it or hidden it. So everyone from your listeners is invited to go and look it up.
No, so here's bouncing off of that. In the early days, one of the super fans of this show quit listening because she wanted the United States to invade Ukraine to stop the Russian invasion. Because she's like, well, they're killing my friends, they're killing my friends. And I said, do you know what would kill Ukrainians faster? B-52s bombing Russian positions in the Donbass. You haven't lived until a machine drops 100,000 pounds of something overhead and there's explosions happening everywhere. I said, you want war, old-fashioned war, like old-fashioned buy war bonds, V for victory, save your scrap war. That's how you get that. I said, here's what's happened that's so brilliant. We have found a way to destroy post-Soviet Russia without lifting a finger. All we have to do is throw money at the problem and a lot of excess equipment, most of which was sitting in warehouses in Nebraska, not doing anything anyway. And the Ukrainians are doing the dying. And by the time this is all over, what will there be left of the Russian Federation? Not much. Rumor has it they're holding things all on by a thread over there. Um, so you know, so I never understood the people who thought a hot war with Russia was the solution. However, it's hard to square that with the 2013 move of the Obama administration letting Putin annex Crimea. So I'm in terms of just linear time, in terms of in 2013, well, in 2012, Obama gets caught on the hot mic. Putin asks him about Crimea, and he says, "Wait till after the election." Putin does. Crimea gets annexed. There's a kerfluffle in the West, but by and large, Putin gets away with it. There's no real, a bunch of press releases get written, angry press releases in London and Berlin and Washington, but nothing ever comes of it. Fast forward 7 more years, all of a sudden we have an invasion. Some people say, I tend to be of this opinion, we should have stopped it then. And because we didn't then, we're not now. We're in this position where we are now. Um, how does that all, I mean, given what has happened, how does the Obama administration's allowance of the annexation of Crimea square with Biden's administration backing the Ukrainians in this war? And by the
Okay.
way, Joe Biden was vice president when Crimea got let go. So, to some degree, except for the Trump blip in the middle, it's been under the same management sort of thing. Um, I can't quite square that circle. How do those policies match up?
Because they are not, despite what we are being told, two completely different issues: Crimea and the rest of the Ukraine. My Ukrainian friends are not going to be happy when they hear me say that, but Crimea in Ukraine was an accident of history. And in fact, one of these very big oversight accidents, in the sense that, as we all know, Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union during the 60s, he was the one who actually figured on the Soviet side during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was Ukrainian. So at some point, he decided to just redraw the completely internal borders that meant absolutely nothing in the monolithic Soviet Union,
Mm,
and move Crimea, which was until the 60s always part of Russia, inhabited by Russians, mostly, and Tatars, move it into Ukraine. Remember, at the time, there was never any inkling that Ukraine, Soviet Socialist Republic, would ever be any different from the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. It's
right.
like US states adjusting their borders. You wouldn't expect that this is going to somehow 40, 50 years down the line is going to be a cause for war. But there you are. So this
Right.
is the Crimea thing. The and that is why President Obama, with Vice President Biden, said, well, there's not much that we can do. In fact, it was, I believe, that Obama himself mentioned, used this term. The Russians were capable, and still are, of escalation dominance, as it is called, meaning in geostrategy that they have the choice of how far to escalate or not at the time of their choosing. And let's not forget also that there was hardly a single shot fired during the annexation of Crimea, unlike the fierce resistance that took place with the Ukrainians against the invasion in 1922. And another thing, just to show, final point, to show how Crimea is a bit very different from what we understand as Ukraine. When Ukraine gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, Crimea had a local elected council. So they were the local representatives for Crimea. And whilst Ukraine was proclaiming independence from the Soviet Unions, the Crimean parliament was declaring independence from Ukraine because they did not want to be part of a different, separate state, and they wanted to remain part of Russia. That didn't work out, as we know. But if you see things and you hear things which are really true, and anyone can look them up, then you understand that, well, Crimea, it's good to be friendly to the poor Ukrainians, but whether they should get Crimea back, that's a big whether and if, and whether they should get it back.
Yeah, I think no matter how this ends, Crimea stays Russian.
That's
If they think they're good, I don't think that's going to happen. You will pry that warm water port from Russia's cold, dead hands. That
correct.
is that port is more valuable than I mean anything. I mean, there is not anything strategically that Russia can live without a lot. That bit of land is the one thing they cannot not have, basically.
Yes.
So the holding on to that, the price is not too high, you
It-
know.
that's how they feel it. Mind you, I've been talking to my students. Last time I was at the end of last year in Russia, and I've been talking to especially my male students, trying to gauge their understanding of what happens if they get called up. Obviously, there was only one draft that happened, but we didn't know at the time that there was not going to be a second caller. And don't forget, these are very westernized Russians speaking excellent and fluent English because I teach in English, not in Russian. And that's the language of their learning. Obviously, they are from families that are to some extent what we would understand as westernized. And I hope that doesn't sound negative to them in any way. So what they said, my students said most of them were not too keen to go and fight against Ukraine. The reason for that is not that they were opposed to Putin or they thought it as adventurism, but because my students and the vast majority of Russians perceive this as a civil war, as a fratricidal struggle, and they didn't want to be involved in that. On the other hand, I asked them, well, what if the Ukrainians, assisted by NATO, by the West, attacks and wants to take back Crimea? They all said, yes, in that case, we will gladly go and fight.
And that's why I think Crimea will stay safely with Russia. That yes, one of the things that I found interesting in the early days was um how much, you know, I think people kind of forget the locality. In the United States, we're used to wars always being far away because geographically we're not near where anything exciting happens. The reality is a lot of, if you grew up in Western Russia, this was a relatively short trip sort of thing. And I think all that video footage of, Russian soldiers borrowing phones to call their family about how the war was going, or, and this one always made me laugh, the guy on the phone to his girlfriend having an argument if raping Ukrainian women was cheating or not. And I'm just kind of like, this is what war does to people. It shatters us psychologically. Um, and modern technology allows this to happen in real time. Back in the day, you had to write a letter, dearest Loudmila, sort of thing. Nowadays, we have cell phones. You can have the argument instantaneously. Truly a war for the 21st century. Um, Someone from the War College here in America mentioned that this is creating Ukrainian national identity. Do you think that there's now that separation between Russia and Ukraine now has its own nationalist identity that's going to basically exist standing in opposition to the greater Russian threat?
Yes, absolutely true. If there is a way to create a national identity, a group identity, a team identity, the best way you can do this is by attacking that team, that group, that nation. Even
Right.
even the ones who were sort of wishy-washy about, well, Ukraine, let's not forget that a large part of them were half and half Ukrainian, half Russian, whatever. Even these ones have now said, well, okay, we draw the line at being attacked and attacked so viciously as well. So, yes, now the majority of the pre war Ukrainians, I would easily say that they would want to be Ukrainians. That's does not take into account, however, a minority who feel so Russian that they felt that they were saved by the Russian intervention. These people exist as well. And for example, in the Donbass, the separatists and all that, which is,
And that had been going on for years preceding the invasion anyway.
yeah, 2014. So yes, it is a minority that would choose to live under Russia, but the majority definitely feel very much Ukrainian now.
So let's talk about how this ends. I have said this war continues at the pleasure of three people. Um, President Biden, the rotating circle of fools in London, um, and Mr. Schultz in Berlin. If Western Europe and the United States decide this war is done, it ends very quickly because they're the ones paying for it and supplying the equipment for it. Um, I think there's room for discussion for an off-ramp to bring this to a close. What do you think that looks like? How does this end?
Well, before we get to that, let's mention some figures by an estimate that I made, a back of the envelope estimate, admittedly. This war has costed to the West 700 billion euros, that's almost a trillion, a bit under $1 trillion. That's the cost only to the West. Unlike what people think in USA, the majority of this 700 billion euros has actually been committed by the European Union. The largest.
Christine Lagarde was on television the other day talking about that very thing, actually.
So
The European commitment was at parity with or not greater than the United States.
it is bigger. The United States provides more armament simply because they have it. I mean, as we know, the Europeans until last year they couldn't fight a war that would last 2 days, let alone 2 years.
Yeah.
So it was only the US that had the capacity and the stores of weapons to give.
Although
So
big shout out to the Poles who have come in and, as we would say in the streets, they've come in clutch with equipment. There's great stories of them shoving MiG-29s into the forest and then calling Ukraine and be like, so you should check out this forest. There's some stuff there for you, sort of thing. Poland has done yeoman's work on this in terms of moving stuff, I mean, they've just done, because Poland knows Ukraine today, us tomorrow. So they're invested. But I mean, yes, it's been a huge effort, and and the amount of international cooperation has been tremendous as well.
well, I would take with a pinch of salt what the Polish mentioned, that they feel it's not going to be Poland tomorrow after if Ukraine capitulates, because the Russians have absolutely no need to invade anyone else. As we mentioned before, the situation in Ukraine was entirely different. They if you if anyone would go to the primary and secondary sources ever since 2008 and see what the Russian politicians were saying, they had been making extremely clear that they, at some point, all hell would break loose about Ukraine. They, on the other hand, they have been saying that they have absolutely nothing, no other, they don't have their sights on any other country. That includes the Baltic states that we mentioned before and Poland. And it's very difficult to simply just attack another country to take it over. Let's not forget that the reason why this happened now with Ukraine was, first of all, the Russians got involved because of the pro-Russian part of the population. And number two, yes, there was a full invasion, which they expected to last for a couple of weeks and be a splendid little war for them. How is this going to end? Well, I am afraid that this will end with the papers, the drafts used in March 2022 being brought up back to the negotiating table after the millions, after the that we have spent, after the destruction wrought upon Ukraine, after the tens of thousands of dead on both sides, and after the creation of a huge rift within Europe, because this reflects extremely badly in Europe's geopolitical aspirations, as in not necessarily as in being dragged by the United States into doing things that they didn't really want to do. Did you notice how reticent the Europeans were at the beginning? And in fact, it was after being pushed by USA and Britain that they started relenting.
Yeah, there was definitely yeah, I mean there's definitely been, I think, to Zelensky's frustration, a certain arm length holding out of Ukraine from the rest of the European project. And it is, yeah, and Anthony Blinken, spent months dashing around Europe drumming up support for a war that nobody in Western Europe really wanted. Um, but I mean, it has been a testament to international cooperation of all that has happened and all the help that has come in and all the things that have happened strategically. It's quite impressive. Um, that this has happened and NATO's held together. But I mean, I guess what I'm looking for is, do you think they can get Putin to the negotiating table? Are we talking 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years? How much longer are they willing to continue on with this? Because it's not
The
going
Russians,
anywhere. They're stuck in Donbass. It's a Sitz Creek if there ever was one. Like, get out your World War One memes, everybody. Nobody's moving fast anywhere. How much longer do you think they're going to put up with that?
very good observation. It is as it is now. There's not going to be any differences or breakthroughs within the battlefield. It is possible, actually conceivable, quite expected that the Russians are going to launch a summer offensive, and they have been getting ready for that. Again, if they do not make, even though they do have the firepower for this, they don't have the manpower, but they do not want to draft young Russians into this. So they'll have to make do with what there is. The Russians, as far as you can read and what, according to what analysts say, and the bits and pieces that I hear on the grapevine from the few sources that I have, they're quite ready to negotiate, and they're quite ready to negotiate seriously. It's not a subterfuge to gain some time in order to continue the war. The only thing keeping right now the negotiations from happening is essentially the United States. And of course, the United States, I understand, they cannot just be seen to cave in and finally, after 2.5 years of this rhetoric, suddenly say, oh, well, why don't we make some peace now? And I think we've had it. That certainly not publicly. The only thing that they can do is that they can let the Ukrainians, Zelensky, know that the whole thing is winding down. So he'd better find a way to do this. But there's not going to be for Ukraine peace, or it's unlikely for a peace treaty to be signed with Russians under Zelensky. A number of analysts have said that Zelensky will not be in the position, will not want to be in the position to sign a peace treaty. So the presidential elections that have not been held, they should have been held, as we know, some months ago, should elect a new president who would be able to put the name on the dotted line. As I said, I expect more or less the same things to be part of the draft treaty as they were in 2022 March. This, one of the most important things is Ukraine neutrality, as in never joining NATO. And once the Russians get that, then they will stop. If the Russians do not get the never join NATO clause, in addition to Crimea that we said is also a big red line, the war will continue for as long as it takes, decades.
So, let's think about this. So, the peace treaty can't happen under Zelensky, which I think is, hold that thought. We're going to come back to that in a second. And Ukraine can't join NATO, but could they join the EU?
Well, originally, from what I hear, originally there was going to be a kind of compromise whereby Ukraine would join eventually the EU. That wasn't going to happen overnight. We're looking at 10, 15 years down the line.
Of course.
Yeah.
And there's that new tiered membership thing they're doing.
Exactly. So they were going to get they would get the EU membership eventually. And in the meantime, of course, EU assistance, as long as they promise to stay out of NATO. Now, let us not forget, however, there are some very important legal implications there. In 2019, the Ukrainians were blind enough, foolhardy enough to actually include in their constitution by amendment the fact that the ultimate strategic goal of the Ukraine is to become a member of the European Union and a member of NATO. This happened in early 2019. When I read that, I said, well, war is now inevitable. The only reason why it happened in 22 and not in 2020 was because of the pandemic. It was postponed.
Right. And that makes sense. And obviously, there's going to be some new constitutional changes happening in Ukraine to make that peace deal work. Why not Zelensky? Why is peace under him impossible?
Well, first of all, he has said himself that he would never go to negotiate anything that does not include the full return, all this list that the Ukrainians have given, the full return of the territories as they were in in 2014, which includes Crimea.
Right.
The fact that there's going to be a tribunal, international tribunal, which would try only the Russians accused of war crimes and crimes against peace and massive reparations. This is what he has been standing by. This is what he has been telling in every single one of the parliaments that around the world that he has been traveling through. He mentioned that in the US Congress as well. So he cannot make an about face now and sign anything which does not include any of these terms that we just mentioned. Plus, again, the Ukrainians, stridently so, and good for them, if you want, foolhardy again, they have voted a law, thankfully not in the constitution this time, they have voted for a law which forbids negotiations with Russia.
So basically you're saying that we cannot have movement forward until, I guess, Zelensky's gotten rid of and some laws and things in Ukraine are changed, and then all of a sudden maybe we can have a peace treaty with Russia. That's probably going to involve eastern parts of Ukraine moving back to Russia. Like,
well, as it is now, there will be some parts that will be kept by Russia. I see that as inevitable. I could see partial withdrawal from the Russian side in order to achieve the much more important goals of keeping Crimea in perpetuity and also Ukrainian non-NATO membership again in perpetuity. But as we know, once you have conquered something by the force, land by the force of arms, it's very difficult to completely go and say, okay, fine, we give it back, unless you're being offered something incredibly valuable instead.
Well, that's where the West may be helpful. You know, I mean, in terms of, you know, land for sanctions relief, land for money, the US Treasury has billions of Russian assets locked up. You know, that could be the bigger thing, and Russia could use the cash.
Russia is not doing economically too badly, even though it is the most sanctioned country in the history of the world. It has done surprisingly well. This shows that the Russian establishment were preparing for some kind of confrontation with the West, not this kind that we have now, something a bit milder, and that's why they buttressed the economy as much as they could. The money that has been frozen is 700 billion dollars, I believe. And most of it, the largest majority, is held in Belgium. The US Treasury has some, but not the most. And of course, it's in Belgium and other countries, it is also frozen because the EU has imposed sanctions as well. Of course, the Russians would like that money back, but we should not ever confuse Russia as a simply larger version of Venezuela, Iran, North Korea, or other starving states that we can simply overturn their wills by holding some money in front of their noses. This is not going to work for Russia. Not that they will disdain that, but the geostrategic is much more important than the economic for the Russians.
I've heard that Putin is in poor health. Any truth to that?
There's a lot of Russian propaganda. Do you believe that?
No, that's why I'm asking you. I don't buy it. I don't, I mean, I think, but mostly because of where I hear those rumors from. When I see the source of who says, "Oh, Putin has all this everything," I'm like, well, yeah, thanks a lot, Epoch Times. You're owned by the Falun Gong who are crazy. Like, I disregard sort of thing. But I mean, it's been this floating thing that Putin is in poor health and perhaps he will die, and this whole thing comes crumbling down. I just thought I would ask it as a final bombastic question because we're at the hour.
No, absolutely not. I believe that he's in very fine health. He's doing well. And let's not forget that we have heard dozens of rumors, propaganda, of course, uh, from the beginning of the invasion, saying that Putin is about to die. He's on medication that makes him completely unaccountable. He's crazy. He's dead and he has been replaced by body double. You take, you name it. It's
Oh
been there.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, they've been doing the body double one for a long, long time. That's an old favorite of the
Yes,
yes.
exactly. I mean,
Yes.
the only thing I didn't hear, although I'm sure it must be in some very cranky areas of the internet, is that in fact, Elvis Presley still lives and has disguised himself as Vladimir Putin.
That's the ultimate thing. All and then all we need him is for to be smoking weed with Bob Marley in Jamaica, and we'll have the hat trick of dead people, And they were driven there by Tupac as well. Yes, yes, yes. The listener will excuse me. I'm recovering from a head cold today. I got a lot of medication together to be able to do this, but didn't want to miss a reschedule. Um, thank you so much for coming on the show. Why don't you tell us where we can find you online and keep up with your work?
I my my work in I do not have a personal blog. I am a commentator. If the best place where you can actually read what I have written about Ukraine is just and the war and Russia is just make a search of my name, Dimitrios Floudas, with the words Russia and Ukraine next to it. And then there will be all sorts of articles in different publications.
No, that is absolutely true. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
My great pleasure. It has been lovely talking to you, Cameron.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you.